So good evening, everyone, and welcome to a highly anticipated event on the Canadian Publishing Calendar. Welcome to this, the official launch of Alexandra Morton's remarkable new book, Not on My Watch. My name is Ian Gill, and my partner Zoe Grams and I are co-founders of Upstart and Crow, a literary arts studio here on Granville Island. I wish to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations, Salmon people all. I'd also like to acknowledge our partners in tonight's event, the Tyee, Penguin Random House Canada, and an initiative that I helped to co-create and that I hope you're going to hear a lot more about in the weeks and months to come, called Salmon Nation. So Alexandra Morton has written a book, and what a book it is. We're about to be joined by Alex, but first a few details about the event. Just a word on technical support. I'd like to thank our event tech for this evening, M. Cooper, and our event support, Ariel Hudnall. We're hoping for smooth online sailing, obviously, but if there's any mishaps, any sound losses or other gremlins, it'll be M solving for that. If we need to pause for the event for a moment or two, it'll be their voice that you will hear. About the event itself, in a moment, I'm going to be joined by Alexandra, beaming to us live from her home in Swantula. The two of us are going to chat for about 20 minutes about her book, and then at the bottom of the hour, we'll be joined by two Indigenous leaders who've worked tirelessly to remove salmon farms from BC coastal waters, Don Svanvik and Bob Chamberlain. Our third panelist, Simca Martin, has unfortunately had to bow out for personal reasons. We'll discuss Alex's book with her in the Zoom and what needs to happen next in this fight for wild salmon. And then we'll have a question and answer session, and we'll wrap up by about 8:30, maybe a little before. In terms of your questions, for those of you who have questions for Alex or for the panelists, you can ask them in the online chat function. Our moderators will pass them along to me to share with the panel, and we'll get through as many of those as we can. Finally, for those of you who don't yet have a copy of the book, you can pick one up here at Upstart and Crow, or from any of your independent local bookstores. And so now, this is why we're all here. Thank you so much for your interest in what is a vitally important topic, not just for our coast, but for our country. I'm thrilled to say that more than 1,100 people have registered for this event, people from far and wide. Alex's book has immediately made it onto the bestseller list, and for good reason. It is a must read. And so without further ado, please welcome the renowned whale researcher, wild salmon activist, and now I'm happy to say best-selling author, Alexandra Morton. Alex, good to see you.
Hi, good evening. It's great to be here.
Welcome and congratulations are obviously in order. Alex, this is an amazing book and it's flying off the shelves, and it's a bit of a publishing sensation, I have to say. So congratulations, but it's hardly a book to get people dancing in the streets for joy. So tell us right off the top what the central message is in your book. What have you witnessed on your watch?
Well, this is a story about what has been happening to the salmon of British Columbia, about an industry that came in and, like so many other large industries, just decided to have its way with this beautiful place. And government helped it. Government hid the impacts. Government did not make this industry behave and meet the expectations of Canadians, ignored the First Nations whose territory it was operating in. And so I was maybe one of the least prepared people to deal with this. I went into this incredibly beautiful piece of wilderness, the Broughton Archipelago. Chief Don Swanvik is here tonight, and Bob Chamberlain, and this is their territory. And I went there to study whales for the rest of my life. I really wanted to figure out what this large-brained animal was saying. And when the first salmon farms moved into this remarkable. It was basically wilderness with 3 First Nation villages and the tiny community of Echo Bay with no ferries, no electricity, no telephones. We did get mail by seaplane 3 times a week, and we did have a 1-room school. And when the industry came in, I thought it was going to be good for us. That's what we were told. The government said this is going to be good for you. And it wasn't until the commercial fishermen started to talk to me a couple of years in, and they're like, they're putting these things in all the wrong places. Could you write a letter to DFO for us? I was like, sure. I just thought I was going to write a couple of letters. But it went on and on and on, and the impacts got worse. We got toxic algae blooms and Atlantic salmon in the rivers, and the orca I was studying left. The community was destroyed. First Nations were ignored in the warnings. And I just kept escalating alongside of it. And then most recently, I got to witness the most incredible thing, and that is these ancient First Nation governments reconstituting around this issue and basically saying enough. And so now in this one area, we're starting to watch the salmon go to sea without being covered with sea lice and being harmed. However, the industry is still operating in other parts of this coast, and it just hopefully we can move towards that. But I really felt I needed to write down the whole story because it was just so unbelievable that really no one believed it. And so I wrote it all down.
It's a tough read. I mean, it's a real cry to action and a real cry from the heart in a lot of ways, but it is a tough read because you just keep. I kept reading thinking, well, surely they can't do anything else wrong, or they're not going to lie about the next thing, or they're not going to do another deal, or they can't possibly do anything worse. And it just kept getting worse. So it's tough to read, but how was it to write? I mean, what was it like to write this book?
Well, I knew I should write it down, and it was always such an exhausting thought. I didn't want to do it until the occupation happened. And that led to the year-long negotiations that both of
This
the
is
men.
the occupation of one of the salmon farms.
Yes, in the winter of 2017, a group of First Nations decided to stay on the farms until they left. And so I worked alongside of them and eventually occupied a farm myself. And this was a chaotic, painful event. It was also exhilarating. But it was so interesting to see how it happened, how all of these pieces lay around, and then suddenly it ignited. And through peaceful, honorable, immovable action, it started to change. And it was like a relay race. We were just passing the baton, the people on the outside to the people on the inside. And it's still going on today. And I thought, I have to write this down. And once I started writing, Ian, I just couldn't stop. This was the January, February of 2019, and I was writing 12, 14 hours a day. It just poured out of me. And it felt so good to just get the story out.
Yeah, I bet. I mean, there are some lovely moments. I have to say that one of the things I was really impressed by was how good a writer you are. So it's really well written.
I had a good editor. I just have to.
Yeah,
say.
they all say that, and I actually know that you did have a good editor.
I did have a good editor.
You did have to write it. It is a tough read, but there's some lovely moments. One of my favorites is your description of the wild members of the A5 pod of whales, and you write that the sounds that they made were technically very similar to the ones as the whales in captivity. Would you say the wild orca's calls echo off the submerged canyons of the deep inlets of the Broughton Archipelago to define the space, the way music from an organ fills a cathedral? Oh my God, I felt like I was under the water there. I mean, that's pretty lyrical for a biologist.
Yes, but biologists fall in love with the animal they're studying because we follow it for so long. It becomes like a member of our family, and particularly orca, which are just so honorable and fascinating and graceful, and just everything about them is beautiful. But yes, to I went from listening to them in a tank where I could hear the drain and, the horrible, I thought they were beautiful there, but then when I put the underwater microphones and I heard them underwater, it was just a whole nother experience. Yeah. Well, they see with sound, so they're probably creating images with sound as well.
So you, with this researcher, with this great enthusiasm, this love for the creatures you were studying, you fell into this role of activism. And a lot of the book concerns the actions or inactions of Fisheries and Oceans Canada, DFO, as it's known. What's wrong with DFO? What is it about DFO?
Well, when you think about it, they never really have been about protecting fish. I mean, they destroyed the North Atlantic cod, and they allowed Mount Polly to spill all the, tailing waste into Quesnel Lake, one of the biggest rearing area for salmon in the Fraser River, and never did anything. And, this was a question that haunted me, and I went after it. So there's this incredible thing in Canada. You can go on a website, and for $5, you can order the conversation between a number of people in government on a certain subject between two dates. Well, I've ordered hundreds of those. I've read thousands of pages. So I know what they're thinking because I'm reading what they are writing. And every time a scientist, myself or others or scientists in DFO found a problem, their primary motive was to write the media lines. To convince the public, first of all, there's no problem, and well, maybe if there is a problem, we're on top of it. They never said, oh my gosh, all hands on deck, let's figure out what's going on, let's stop this, let's protect this run of fish. There are people in DFO that are doing that, and I read their emails too, and they're seeing the same thing I am. But the senior management level in DFO has gone terribly wrong. And that is because they were given a mandate to promote salmon farms and to protect wild salmon. And then there was a huge department made to promote salmon farms. And there was nobody put in the position at a manager level to protect wild salmon. So that aquaculture management group has gone way over the line. Highly questionable ethics. It's going on today. So I feel a little bit like grandma, you guys have been naughty and you need to just step away from the fish. And, DFO needs to renovate this manager level and invite First Nations to occupy some of these positions because First Nations want salmon and they're very clear about that. And their governments are set up so that they can protect wild salmon. And so they need that perspective in there.
I mean, reading the work that you did too as a scientist and knowing that you traveled all over the coast, you went right up into the headwaters of the Fraser and all over the place to basically track down what was happening. So you're one person. DFO has 12,000 employees and a $3 billion budget. I kept thinking that's the work they're supposed to do. Like,
I know people said that to me all the time, but I made a decision early on to stay small. A lot of people said initially, Alex, you need to get big. You need to form a big organization. But I wanted to be small so that when I heard about a virus, I could go chase it. And the way I did it was I found researchers whose whole life was that virus or that parasite or that bacteria. And I teamed up with them. And none of us went on salary. There was no big budgets written for this. I call it guerrilla science. And it really was just like the preliminary science for all of this. And so I went all over the place and gathered the evidence and packaged it up as per their instructions. And then we wrote the papers together and we got it published in scientific journals. But I know people have told me again and again, you're a whale biologist. You have no business chasing viruses. I agree, but nobody else was doing it. And the people in DFO that were trying to do it, there are remarkable scientists in DFO, but they were muzzled. And so somebody had to go out there and start blundering around and saying, hey, look, you've got Piscine Rio virus here. You've got ISA virus, you've got salmon alpha virus. You got tenacibaculum. Somebody needed to, that was free and unencumbered, that would be able to say that. And then, you know, the big teams, the big scientific teams have always come in afterwards.
Right. And so, you know, I guess for a lot of people, and there is some science in this book, but it's not scientific, you know, it's not unapproachably scientific. It's really, it's kind of like a whodunit almost, and a bit of a page turner sort of crime nonfiction. But there's a lot of people out there who I think appreciate the work that you've done, and wonder what they can do. So you've said that trying to reason with or lobby with DFO to actually use science has failed. And we said in our tagline that was written for this event, you know, why the fight for wild salmon is about more than fish, because there's not millions of Canadians necessarily who get up every morning living and breathing thinking about salmon or wild salmon or fish of any description. So why is this fight about more than fish? Before we get to how we fight the fight further, why is it about more than fish? Because it's a lot more than about fish, isn't it?
Well, it is. And so it's about how we as an animal are going to learn to survive on this planet. That is one of the components of it. Because if we go around breaking everything and cutting all the supply lines that we depend on, like salmon, which are moving enormous amount of nutrients from the open ocean up into the rivers, feeding the trees that make the oxygen we breathe and pulling the carbon out of the atmosphere. If we don't learn how to notice that this is going on and how important it is, our chances of survival are not very good. But this is also about how we behave as a people in terms of reconciliation, in terms of, you know, how we behave in the territories of people who have been here for thousands and thousands of years, who did not wreck the system, who actually functioned quite well. You know, you might be surprised, but the Broughton Archipelago apparently had over 10,000 First Nation people living there. Well, now there's just a handful of people left, and the salmon are gone, and you know, the place is on the rocks. So there's a lot of learning and respect and how to work together that needs to go on. And once we figure that out, and I'm sure it's going to be an ongoing process for a long, long time, but once we figure that out, things are going to go a lot better. I mean, there'll be much more economic activity. There will be food security. There'll be, you know, tourism dollars, all kinds of things. And we learn to respect the life that we actually are part of and depend on. So, I mean, I personally can't believe I spent my whole life, I used up my whole life fighting salmon farms. It boggles my mind that happened. But it's because this amazing fish, this wild salmon, which, you know, really is a gift we're not going to be given again, is so important. And I think I also want to encourage all the people that are on the front lines. I think about the people at Fairy Creek right now all the time and what that feels like. And activism is extremely important, not protesting, but activism, where you put your body in the way and you do it in an honorable way with the right message. We have to do this right now because there is a madness upon this planet that is not leaving anything for the children.
How are the fish doing right now?
Well, we're just waiting for the little ones to come out of the rivers right now. A few of them are out, so we don't really know. But so the nations of the Broughton Archipelago have removed 5 salmon farms already, and the men who are, I hate it that I'm being highlighted and they're not, but eventually you're going to see Bob Chamberlain and Don Swanvik, and they were very instrumental in getting these 5 farms removed, and there's more that are going out. And so last spring, for the first time in 21 years, I went to the place where I always look at these salmon, these little tiny juvenile salmon. And instead of being covered in lice and emaciated and sinking and their eyes all cloudy, they were fat and sassy. They were sparkly, silver and blue. Their eyes were so dark because I put them in a little baggie with water and I hold a hand lens. So I'm looking at that fish like eye to eye. They're so black. You feel like you're looking into another world. They were making it to sea. They were surviving. And this summer, those little pink salmon are going to come back. So we'll see. I'm now studying the impact of removing salmon farms. So I'm very excited about that.
But you're also back in court against DFO.
Oh, yes. So that's just one area of the coast. So to the south of us is the Discovery Islands, where 1/3 of all of British Columbia's salmon migrate. And the salmon farming licenses expired in December. And so that triggered consultation with 7 First Nations, which the Minister of Fisheries, Bernadette Jordan, was actually personally involved in. And so was Bob Chamberlain on the line here. And those nations said, get the farms out. And miraculously, the minister said, okay, that's what we'll do. And so these 3 companies, which is all we really have here, I mean, those are the major salmon farming industry in British Columbia, is just 3 companies with head offices in Norway, were told that they can't put any more fish in their farms, no more Atlantic salmon into these farms. They can grow the ones that are there, they can't put any more in. Well, that means, first of all, a large portion of the Discovery Islands are going to be free of salmon farms. This is the greatest single decision the government of Canada has ever made to protect wild salmon. It wasn't an inquiry or an investigation. It's actual on the ground relief for these fish. But one of the companies, Maui, has decided it's a good idea to sue Canada to force 7 nations to accept millions of Atlantic salmon going back into their territories after they were, as clear as could be, they did not want them there. So that decision could come tomorrow or early next week. This is not a good look for this company. I don't know what they're thinking. But yeah, the life of the Fraser River sockeye are in the balance because that run is so low that some of the tributaries of the Fraser only had 20 fish return.
Well. So to go back to something you said earlier about First Nations governments and about their role in all of this, I think that's actually a good segue for us because we want to bring Don and Bob into the conversation. But say just a little bit more about that from your point of view, and then we'll sort of use that to introduce them because it seems to me you've kind of given up on DFO. Goodness knows what the province is all about because the province actually is involved too. They're not, they don't have clean hands in this, surely.
Well, I just don't think the non-Indigenous governments have the equipment to save anything. I don't think they have the right department or the right people. They are overseeing the death of this part of the planet. And there's good people in there. And they're good before they get in. And then they get in there and they can't move, they can't do anything. It's a quagmire, and the companies have so much power over these governments that they're really kind of in gridlock. But when you're talking to a First Nation government, you're talking to a very local government. And, these governments were formed at a time when if they wiped out wild salmon, it was the death of their village. So they are constructed to protect wild salmon and the other species. And I'm happily working with First Nations. They say to me, Alex, what do the fish need? And I tell them what I think the fish need, and that's all I need to do now. It's really wonderful.
Well, let's, I think you and I could talk for hours about this, and we have just one more hour of people's time and attention. And I feel a little like we haven't done enough justice to your book, but actually the really good thing is there's so many surprises there that people will want to go out and get it and read it for themselves, and we encourage them to do so. But let's open up the conversation to two people who really are leading lights in the fight for wild salmon in this province, from Alert Bay, your neighbour, Don Svanvik, and from North Vancouver, a great political voice for wild salmon, Bob Chamberlain. So I don't quite know how this happens, but gentlemen, welcome. And there you are. And so what I'm hoping is, Don, rather than me mangle an introduction to you, we talked about the fact that we'd love you to introduce yourself or tell us who you are, where you are, and tell us, to kick off this part of the conversation, about the importance of wild salmon to you and to the Numgees people.
Okay, well, hello everybody. My name is Don Svanvik. My dad was a Swede, so that means he was a Swede who lived in Finland. My mother comes from the Numgees, Kwagil, Kuskimuk, a little bit of Klawitsis. I stand up for my family in the big house, represent our family in the big house, and my name is Homiskinis. On the other front, I'm also the elected chief counselor of the Numgees First Nation. And salmon, we're salmon people. We're people of the salmon. We look at our creation story. Our ancestor, the transformer, asked him what he wanted to be and gave him several choices. And ultimately he chose a river, so that the river would run for as long as the days dawn on the earth and provide salmon to all our people. And we have the river, our name for it is derived from his name. So the river that's commonly called the Nimkish River, the real name is Ikwatni. And that's the river. As a young child, I was able to go over and get in the way and have just a blast, as the older guys would cast the net out with beach sand at that time. And it's anybody who got to do that, it's one of the most fondest memories we have. You got to get wet, you got to wrestle with a fish, and then you got to bring fish home to your family. My grandfather would send me out and say, just, you have it going out of that boat there, they're going fishing. So we'd go and do that. And that would be the only time as young teens we'd get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to do. I probably up until the past decade or a little more, consume salmon at least once a week, and that's getting really, really hard to do. Well, it's not possible anymore. I don't have enough salmon. Alex mentions all the benefits we've come to understand about salmon. From a First Nations perspective, all those are absolutely true, but our lives revolved around salmon. Our seasons, what we did, how we potlatched, how we respected each other. It was a trade item. Fish were even a monetary unit. We were fortunate enough to have a river that was bountiful in all 5 species of Pacific salmon. And with that, we're able to have protocols with other nations where they'd get some fish and we'd get clams in their territory, or get ooligans in their territory, Night Inlet and Kinkum. All these things, that how our world revolved, and it was the basis was taking what you needed. And I see that's kind of where we go wrong. I'm not gonna go too far because maybe I won't stop. I'm gonna leave some room for Bob. But I want to make sure I get this one across to everybody, is that what we have to do here is we have to make the survival of salmon, the non-extinction of salmon, the absolute top priority in this fight. There can't be any parallels with it. The economy can't be equal with that, because that's not how it's going to happen. And the benefit far outweighs any of the short gains that we could have in that. So that's what we need to do. We have to get out of the way of salmon, let them do their thing, and they will do it. They're such an amazing species. So I'll pass
Thank
it over
you.
to Bob now, I guess.
Good evening, everyone. Nugwa Gilakame, guys, and I'm coming to you or participating tonight from the territories of the Squamish people in North Vancouver. I had no reservations whatsoever when I was invited to be a part of this tonight. Alexandra Morton, I have the utmost respect for you. I have had the good fortune in the 14 years as elected chief of our First Nation to walk with you, to witness your tenacity, your honesty, your diligence. And with what my Gekame, my hereditary chief Homiskinis, has spoken about the importance of salmon to our people, it is everything about who we are. And this is not just from a coastal perspective, but it weaves its way up the entire water systems of British Columbia. It is a unifying food source for First Nations across the province. And what we witness is how the governments have forgotten about how important this is to individuals, not just First Nations people, but everyone that's gone fishing with their father and uncle and grandfather. The earliest memory I have about fishing was jigging cod outside of guaya stumps with my Uncle Georgie when I was about 7 or 8 years old. How excited I was to catch a bunch of cod, ling cod and rock cod, and then bring it to my granny and my great auntie in the village and share. And it was something that really is a cherished memory of my childhood, which then extended when I was a commercial fisherman for 12 years in the pursuit of food fish for my family in Campbell River, and knowing that all First Nations across the province were doing this as well. And to finally get across to a premier that salmon is more than just a simple menu choice for First Nations. It is a staple food. It's what we fight tooth and nail for food security for our elders and for our youth, to ensure that we can continue as we always have, no better and no worse than any other people, but wanting to be respected for the human rights that are being denied First Nations. I want to say a special welcome to all the fish farm companies that are watching this evening. You may be startled with what you hear, and what you're hearing is the truth. And I want everyone watching this to take the time to purchase Alexandra Morton's book. I read it this weekend, and it captures the struggle with such clarity. And not only that, but based upon facts of internal communication to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. It is startling. And we must all come together to save wild salmon. There's no drama intended with that statement. If you look at the salmon runs across British Columbia, it's on an extinction spiral unless we do something right now. And we need to contact our MLAs and our MPs. We need to make sure that the government knows that the Broughton Archipelago work is supported by British Columbians. The decision by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans for Discovery Islands, they need to know that the outcome is supported. And I know for a fact that the broad support of First Nations for this is unquestionable. 10 times the amount of First Nations that are in agreement with the industry. But we need to make sure that our voice is heard about the importance of salmon and how we get out of the way strategically. How do we work to build salmon runs for the future? It's really not about us anymore. It's about ensuring this planet has this species for all of us, so we can continue to enjoy what it means to us in our diets, what it means to us in our traditions and our cultures, and what it means to the economy, but most importantly, what it means to the environment. For everyone that loves seeing killer whales jump, we better figure out how to get Chinook salmon back into where the southern resident killer whales are, or we're not going to have them there anymore. And the eagles and the bears and everything that depends upon salmon, the list is endless. And when I see industry and government make decisions around the word mitigation, that tells me that salmon is already in second place, and that's no longer acceptable. And we need to do what we can to ensure that we protect this valuable resource for the planet. And I could go on, being an ex-politician, of course, and
I
just
don't know where
leave
you
it right
come by
there.
the. I don't know where you come by the ex-politician. I think you're putting yourself into retirement a little early.
Well, it's about just standing up like my Uncle Michael Dick taught me, is just tell the truth. And when you tell the truth, you never have to remember anything. You just tell the truth again. And, I think about when Alexandra and I traveled to Norway, where we invited ourselves to some AGMs. And when we were explaining to them that we were appalled that they didn't bring their best understanding of their operations in terms of sea lice and environmental impact. And the smile when they said, we do what your government allows us to do. And so that tells me our environment, our lands are of no consequence to that industry. They brought their worst practices, they knew better, and they did it anyway. And to me, that's just absolutely unacceptable from any industry or corporation.
So what do you say to, this may be a bit invasive of a question or a bit rude, but there are First Nations leaders who've signed on with some of these companies, and I'm sure you have private conversations and maybe you have public ones, but what is the discourse for your communities who have agreed to have salmon farms in their territory, and especially out of what I would say, looking around on the coast, hardship, because the wild salmon fishery is gone, people have to do something, and so companies offer work, they offer some kind of form of income. How do you sort of walk that back, or what does that look like for you, without prying too much into First Nations politics? I mean, that's a thing.
I recall quite clearly a meeting I attended with the Nuu-chah-nulth Tribal Council in Matma's Hall in Port Alberni. And where a very dear friend of mine, Wally Samuel, in our language, he glezala me, he lectured me so I could learn. And he explained very clearly that decisions made in their nation's territories are for them to make. And it was a very great moment for me to open up my mind beyond the activism that we had from our territory. And I realized that if we wanted our answer of no to be respected, the answer yes had to be as well. But now, with the evolution of case law, with the evolution of the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People, certainly the mountain of science that's come forward, I think now First Nations are now reconsidering the value of having a fish farm in their territory. Because I've spoken to leaders from around the province on the coast that do have agreements. And, I can recall a few of them saying, well, they're here, so we might as well get something out of it. But now with the changes of the UN Declaration and case law, that may not be so much the case. And now, like the part that it really resonated with me, well, the whole book did, to be honest, but Alexandra talking about how her passion and pursuit of truth was then branded as activism. And somehow that diminished her work and role that she played. And that's the same for all of us that challenge status quo. And it gets worse when we get the facts and details to present to government that really don't want us to know. And that's where I think now we're at a place where people are realizing the true state of salmon in British Columbia, and we need to do everything we can. And fish farms are an opportunity because of tenures and licenses, but also logging practices and so on. There is a myriad of things that need to be done, but we need to get on with the strategic ones that could cause irreversible harm, like Colin spoke of with disease and pathogens from fish farms.
So, Don, we talked earlier today and last week about science. Where are you and Alex actually just on the use of science in this, or have we sort of moved to a post-science world at the moment?
Well, for me, I'm going to start off with, I absolutely respect every nation's sovereignty. We'll echo what Bob talks about in regard to new things we know. You know, at one point we have DFO telling us that it's fine. And when you're a nation struggling, you don't have anything, and you got somebody waving a little bit of money over here, and then the people that are looking after the ocean say, no, it's fine. It's going to be easy to be enticed into that. So just want to comment on that. In regards to science, you know, when we go to this battle, you know, the best way for us to do it was with rights and title, because of the way science was going. There was all this evidence, but then the gatekeeper was saying it wasn't so, and they weren't doing the work necessary to even make that decision. So, you know, if I look at when I look at it, maybe the favorite part of my book, and I try to read it again, I forgot, it's the source documents. I'm thinking it said something, but that's where all the information came from, and it's all listed on the back of that book. Peer-reviewed studies, the information Alex gets from the Freedom of Information, so all those things, that's empirical evidence about what happens here, and it's still being denied. And you know, so I asked a question. I have a friend who's of several friends. I asked Alex too. Well, what exactly does peer-reviewed mean? And you know, I had a general understanding. Okay, it sounds like there's going to be some other scientists have a look at it, but it goes even much deeper than that. There'd be other people. If you want to get published, there's going to be other people who are experts in that field are going to critique your work. And in order to get through that, you have to jump over all the hoops. You have to have all the facts. Everything's got to line up for your peers to look at and accept that as fact. So it's always been astonishing to me how that gets ignored, you know, when we have that. And this is the first chance I get to mention that, because I've thought about it real lots. I want to ask somebody, what does peer-reviewed mean, to see if you know, because I didn't really know. I had an idea, and I think that's probably the case with most people. You know, you have a basic idea of what it is. But there is empirical evidence, lots and lots of it, that open net pen fish farms are harmful, and way more than just harmful, to the survival of wild salmon. And the evidence is in the book. A similar thing to what Bob mentioned. A wise man once said to me, when things get really messed up, and he used a different verb, he said, you got to fall back on the truth. And that's what this book is doing to us, doing for us. We're falling back on the truth, and people need to look at it and read it and know that that's what's happening. That's what's happened, and that's what's still happening. And we need to change that. So there's a great place for science here, and let's use it. You always hear this term. I can't even remember what it is. We're gonna rely on the best science, whatever. And we haven't been. Let's start doing that. You know, so that's my comments about that.
Ian, if I could pick up, Don's brought up a very important point about peer review science, because you'll recall back in September, DFO spoke about these 9 science papers that showed that there was less than minimal harm to Fraser River sockeye by the operation of fish farms in Discovery Islands. Well, that came out of the Canadian Scientific Advisory Secretariat process. And I invite everybody to poke around on the internet and take a look at that process, because you'll see that from the very first stop to the last stop of that so-called peer review process, industry partners, industry associations are part and parcel of marshaling their views throughout the whole thing. From the presentation of science to the development of terms and reference to doing the actual review or developing a document to summarize the science to the actual peer review process, industry is in there all the way through. And I think Canadians deserve much more in terms of objectivity and independence from a government institution. And we don't have that. And so what we have now is we have someone such as Alexandra that has figured out the path into the inner communications, which absolutely, beyond any question, exposes how accurate Justice Cohen was in the Cohen Commission about the Department of Fisheries and Oceans being in a conflict of interest in terms of its primary responsibility to wild fish and the environment and promoting this industry. It's something that we should all be extremely irritated about.
So what do we do about that, Alex? What, how do you unpick that and put it all back together again? We don't want to put it back together, but how do you get past that into something that works?
Well, so for right now, the battle line is in the Discovery Islands with this company suing the Minister of Fisheries, which, by the way, this is an interesting situation because in all other years, and I've taken this industry to court 5 times, Don has done his turn a couple of times. The minister has always sat with the industry, but she's not anymore. And so I encourage all Canadians to write to Minister Bernadette Jordan and say, thank you for getting the farms off of the Fraser-Sockeye migration route. So, I mean, that is an important thing that needs to happen. This minister has broken away from the senior management. I mean, you imagine you get elected based on, I don't know what, somewhere, and then boom, you're plopped into the position of Minister of Fisheries. And you got all the senior staff. And then there's that woman out there and somewheres who keeps saying this is all wrong. So how is a minister to believe me or Don or Bob or 100 other people? She's supposed to believe her senior managers. And so she's done a very brave thing. And I tend to think it's because she can kind of smell the stench coming off of this thing now and realize there's going to be a scandal. I mean, it's been a heist in broad daylight. It is absolutely scandalous. So that's one thing that can be done. But the other is much more difficult. And that is to provide the support, however it looks, to the other nations that are struggling with this. Because this industry is putting thumb screws on anyone they possibly can. And once you're into a legal agreement with one of these companies, I don't think it's easy to get out of it. And no one was told this was gonna hurt. You know, I know because I was sitting in that little community of Echo Bay when the province came to us and said, this is going to be really good for you guys. And then we were just like squashed. There's 3 people left. The school province actually burnt down our school. So it's you know, it's that reconciliation process, which is there's no pathway. This is new. And you know, the occupation was reconciliation boot camp for me. I learned so much, but most of it is you have to knock on the door and say, I'm here to help, and here's what I think I can do when and if you are ready for my help. You cannot force it. So it's a very delicate thing, but number one, the Minister of Fisheries needs to know right now that what she did was popular.
Yes.
It's I know that sounds silly, but it is really important. And I'm asking everyone to please do that.
So you mentioned reconciliation. I mean, is there any reconciliation with, I mean, like all things like sustainability, these words take on a shape of themselves, and then everything's sustainable when it's not, or everything's reconciled when it isn't, or whatever. But is there any reconciliation with First Nations without wild salmon?
I don't see how that happens. You know, it's we're talking about, you know, I'll give you an example. And I hate even to talk about it, but when reserves were allotted, us on the coast here, we got these small little reserves, you know, in the single digit acres. And what they said was, you don't need land because you have the sea. You guys live off the sea. You don't need all this land. And you know, that's, and it's true. We need land, but we need the sea. We need salmon. We need the cod, the seaweed, everything that's in it, you know, and that's, so I don't see reconciliation without salmon. We need to have salmon.
I think when we consider the word reconciliation, it certainly sets a table to realize the wrongs that have occurred. And when I think about the federal and provincial government's words about wanting to have meaningful reconciliation with First Nations in British Columbia, I think the easiest, well, not the easiest, but a broad path for reconciliation would be a meaningful, multi-year sustained protection, enhancement, rehabilitation of wild salmon, because virtually every First Nation, spare a few of them, rely upon healthy and abundant wild salmon stocks. And if the government has any truth in the words of implementing the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People, this contemplates food security, culture, tradition, environmental protection, decision-making in lands. All of these play a very significant piece in terms of salmon. Now, when we consider that the fish farm companies are always talking about how they have wonderful arrangements with First Nations that are their partners, but when you look at what they're doing in this judicial review that's underway right now, they are seeking to overturn an outcome of First Nation consultation. They're seeking to overturn a Supreme Court process or a Supreme Court directed process to accommodate Aboriginal rights, which are inherent in nature, which means they were here before Canada became Canada. And should they be successful, they are going to turn and transform inherent rights to contingent rights. And that is going to hit every First Nation across this country, because when they're engaged with other industries, industry's going to pick up this ruling and they're going to see. And this is what I've been tweeting about, is I wonder if the First Nations who have partnerships with the industry realize what's happening, because we have fought long and hard, many amazing leaders long before I came around, that established Aboriginal rights in the Constitution and the inherent nature. And here we have an industry self-serving, looking out for their profits, looking to undermine and to subjugate First Nations across this country. And I'm not being dramatic. I know this is fact.
So, are journalists paying attention? We'll get to this in a minute. There's a couple of questions in the chat already starting to arrive. But Don, you were saying, and I think Bob, you've said to me too, that the media just haven't done their job for a long time. I mean, Alex's book is frankly as fine a piece of investigative journalism as I've read in a long, long time. But where were the people whose job it is to keep watch?
Well, my thoughts on that is the attention span of consumers such as myself and everybody else. We have a short attention span. And when you want to get down to the brass tacks of why this industry is so wrong, you have to be able to understand some very complicated scenarios and how they hold hands with each other and how the overall impact needs to be understood and acted upon. And you're not going to be able to accomplish that in a media where you might get a 2-minute story that is trying and attempting to be balanced, which means sharing the industry's perspective. And so I think that reality truly underlines the need for activism, for us to make use of whatever tools we have. And I've said this many, many times, every one of us has one of these phones. This is a tool for activism, short videos, tweets, Facebook, whatever. Build a community, inform the community with fact, and motivate. One of the questions I saw is, what can a normal person do? I'm struggling with what a normal person is, but
there's none of them here.
Well, yeah, I'll raise my hand to that. But we need to write letters to the editor. If you've never done it, do it. And talk to your friends and get them to do it. Write your MLAs, write your MPs. Make sure that your voice is heard in whatever avenue that you can. And, you know, in terms of what we did in the Broughton Archipelago, implementing the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People for the very first time in Canadian history with shared decision-making, that was with the province of BC, because we're talking about provincial tenures being renewed. Discovery Islands was a federal fisheries license being renewed. And so they're different beasts. And of course, we're very proud of the work we did in the Broughton. We were able to transition farms away from what we know are key migratory locations, supported by our TEK, traditional ecological knowledge. And it was good to see the minister make the decision to stand up and to make her decision to remove farms from Discovery Islands. This is the only way we're going to save the Fraser River.
So
I'm going to add, Ian, that certainly agree with Bob, but the media is a business, and you know where they're going. If it's not fitting in the headline, it's not going there. It's more fun and more profitable looking elsewhere, and you want to be buddies with the governments, because that's where you're going to get juicy stuff too. You know, the media that is more independent has been more eager and open to printing the truth. So I think that's a big factor in it, because again, we're talking about the almighty dollar, right? It's
well, Bob
suppressing the truth.
Bob made the point about attention span. I mean, IBM did a study a few years ago, I don't know why, of the attention span of Canadians, and it turns out that it's 7 seconds, which is 1 second shorter than a goldfish. So I don't know how it equates to a sockeye salmon, but that's what you're dealing with in the media. But I mean, that's not an excuse. I mean, you're in the same way, frankly, that Alex did the work of a department, DFO, because they wouldn't go out into the field and do the hard work. You have done the investigation too, but it does seem to me that you've opened a book, no pun intended, Alex, to any number of investigative pathways now that need to continue to be pursued if we're serious about shining a light on what's going on. And ordinary citizens can't do that. So that does seem like a responsibility of the media. But what can normal people, as you were saying, Bob, what can ordinary people do? This is starting to come up, and we'll try and answer a few questions in the chat now from people who are listening in. Alex, you got going on this to some degree, but what can people actually do? Because even writing a letter to the minister or writing a letter to the government is a government that seems captured and corrupted by the contradictions of what it's managing and its own inabilities and its just structures. So does that really do any good, or do we need to do more? And there's actually a couple of people too who have been asking questions about activism. So say more about activism, because you were a reluctant activist and now, Alex, you're a wildly enthusiastic activist. So how do people get there?
Well, they get there because government doesn't listen, and we're watching extinction happen. But, you know, when I was on the front lines, the hardest thing was to get other people to show up. And I just want to say, don't write to people on the front lines and say, I'm behind you, because you know what? No one can see you if you're behind me. Don't say you're in there in spirit. What you need to do, there were people who sent us dog food for the dogs we had. There were people who sent money, blankets. There are activism tourists. We have people come from Germany, and what they do on their vacation time is they go to the front lines because they know it is important to show up and just cook and clean. That's what a lot of frontline activism is. You just have to be there, and it's boring and it's grueling and it's stressful. You just have to create calm and build the campfire and make the food. But there's a lot of ways to show up. Buy someone a bus ticket after COVID. Be creative, and just realize that no matter how average you might think you are or small, you would be amazed for the people on the front lines to have support like that. It was always like, okay, wow, that's fabulous. I remember when a reporter called and said that a First Nation in the interior had written a letter to the editor in support of what we were doing. We were just thrilled. It meant so much to us. So activism is what you do, you know, when you pick up a piece of trash that you did not leave in the road. It has so many shades and dimensions, and we all know what needs to be done in our communities. And I just want to say it feels really good because you switch over from being the victim to something else. Eventually, I occupied a farm by myself because I wanted to try to. There were so many, particularly Indigenous young women on the farms. I was so worried something was going to happen to them, and so I was like, okay, I'm gonna do this. And that moment, and I'm forever thankful for the guy driving the boat that he didn't try to talk me out of it. And I stepped onto that farm. The chemistry in my body changed. It was a huge difference. And I had long conversations with the guys on the farm. It was not, you know, I was not there to fight, but it feels really good, and it is a very, very important thing to do. It's so powerful that the government and the police will come after you and say, you can't do this, and it's wrong, and it's bad. But it is not wrong and bad. And if you can remain peaceful, it's tough though, because when you're out there doing activism, you can't kick the violent guy out because they're there with you. You're not in a room. There's no boundaries. So it is a huge social experiment to do this kind of thing. But I was very lucky, and I feel extremely close to all the people that were on the front lines with me to this day.
There's a question from someone asking, are there any legal avenues to hold the Norwegian companies accountable?
Well, my advice to Maui, Cermak, and Grieg is you should probably get up and go now, because viruses have fingerprints. And one of the remarkable things that has happened, and Don Swanvik gathered a lot of these scientists, there is a remarkable group of loosely associated scientists that talk together but belong to different organizations, work for different First Nations. Some of them are in government, but they have spilled out all over the place into universities, into small research stations, and they are tracking the viruses, the bacteria. There are people who can take the tiniest little clip of a fin and read the immune system of the fish. So the fish begins to talk to us and say, hey, I've got a virus in my heart, or I'm in water that's too warm. And when you get science like that, well, you begin to follow the pathways of where this came from. There's one scientist right now that is tracking the Piscine orthoreovirus, which causes Chinook salmon blood cells to explode. But the salmon farming industry and the talking heads in DFO is like, oh, no, it's fine. It doesn't do anything. And it's always been here. It's endemic. It's local. It's not. And so DFO might have thought they had this suppressed, but it's like trying to suppress a volcano with a yogurt lid. It's not going to work. And honestly, to these companies, you should go, because your viruses are going up the Fraser River. And there are people with rights to the fish that are being destroyed. And it's only a matter of time before this gets traced. So that's my advice to them. I know they never take my advice, but.
So the Norwegians should go. There is an industry, love it or hate it, that has been created based on what you would think is just an unnatural thing anyway, just raising Atlantic salmon in the Pacific Ocean. There are alternatives to this industry, however. What are they, and how should people think about supporting those? How do we keep these coastal communities still alive?
Well, the first thing is, well, we don't give up on wild salmon. Wild salmon, they're an economy in themselves. It's going to take a while to get back to that place So I'm not going to say we're not going to do that again. That widespread economy that goes all over the place, so many people. But the alternative to open net pen fish farms is on land, and it's proven technology. Industry at this point will say no, it's too expensive or doesn't work. There's not enough science on it, but there absolutely is. You know, the Numgies started a small one, and learned real lots along the way. And that information has been shared all over the world. And people are in production now with land-based fish farms, completely out of the water, not impacting the environment at all. And an absolutely green, modern way to do it. You know, the present technique is archaic, you know. And these guys have made, I don't know how much they've made billions. I guess they can correct me if I'm wrong. Now, if they're not willing to invest on land, then maybe our government should. Maybe our feds and province should partner with First Nations, with municipalities, with Canadian entrepreneurs. Let's be more than the labor force, you know. Let's get all the goodies, you know. That's how we're going to make our economy strong. Now we're coming out of COVID. What an opportunity this is, you know. That's what I say we should. That's what we should be pushing for. And I got to add a little bit to the previous one about what can everybody do, and just reiterate what Bob said: stand up and be counted. We can't just have the conversation and say, "Yeah, that's bullshit." We got to stand up and say, write that letter, write it to your MLA, and encourage other people to do it, because we're supposedly in a democracy. I'll call it a quasi-democracy, but it's still there. So when there's more of us and way more of us that say, no, this is no good, they absolutely are going to have to listen. And that is also activism. So there you go.
And you're aware it's kind of hamburger flipping season almost, although with COVID, the MLAs and the MPs probably aren't in the communities, you know, in a normal summer. But surely every politician, whether they're a municipal politician, whether they're a band council chief or leader, or whether they're an MLA or an MP or whatever they are, surely people should be judged by their reaction to Alex's book at this point about this subject. It's the one, it seems, definitive piece which asks and answers so many of the questions that people have had. So is part of activism actually going to your elected representative and saying, read this book, give me honest answers to the questions that are presented in this book?
I say yes.
I say yes.
I do as well. Absolutely.
There's one story in there. We have an MLA here in Victoria, Lana Popham, who I think is incredible. And she wrote a letter during the occupation. She wrote a letter to Maui and said, you know, it's not certain that you're going to get these tenures, and maybe you shouldn't restock these farms. And you know, she was incredibly brave. However, a reporter once accused her of listening to me, and she never talked to me again. So I can see that, you know, they're not free to do everything that they want to do. They do have good intentions in many cases. And when they team up with First Nations governments, such as the one Don is chief counselor of, magic happens. You know, I know people are afraid of First Nations kicking all of us out for really bad behavior. I get that. But look around you, that is not what is happening. And so there's this huge opportunity to, you know, I pay symbolic taxes to the Namgis every year because they're doing so much to protect the place where I raised my children and I live. These indigenous governments are incredibly powerful, and so and when they lock together and start working with the provincial and federal government, well, I mean, the possibilities are enormous. And one of the big problems is these international corporations who are serving shareholders, and that is a very dangerous thing that is really not working out.
So what happens if we lose this fight? What happens if there are no wild salmon? Because, and that sounds like a sort of a wildly apocalyptic sort of thing to imagine, but we've seen this picture before in this country. What happens if we lose wild salmon?
I want to jump in here. We have unity across the province right now on the need to protect and rehabilitate wild salmon. We've identified over 102 First Nations that support the transition of fish farms out of the ocean to land-based closed containment. We have commercial fishermen, sport fishermen, wilderness tourism operators, the Union of BC Municipalities, and we have the First Nation Leadership Council organizations that have all made it very clear to the governments, that how important wild salmon is. So when you consider the Broughton Archipelago, we had a provincial government make decisions to safeguard salmon in a meaningful way. And we've watched them contribute monies of, I think it was like $32 million to the BC SHRIF, where they could have just washed their hands and said, that's a federal responsibility, good luck. But they didn't, they contributed, and they worked towards a solution for wild salmon. And then now we have a federal government that has made some decisions that are in favor of wild salmon. And so what we have is this great awareness going on across the province about why we need to look after the salmon before we look after other industries. And I think that, you know, with the book that Alexandra has penned, the attention it's getting and the information that's coming out. And I think, you know, as far as a citizen of Canada that believes in the government and department that is intended to look after us, we need to really take a look at what we're learning. When we have the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency coming together and strategizing about how to hide an emerging disease so they don't have to report it internationally, that should be a very strong signal that there's something seriously wrong here. Because now we're putting a face on where we want to be evasive with the international community and agreements and covenants that the government has signed. And in terms of where are we at with First Nations, we see the governments are now in some manner and measure implementing the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People. People that want to instill fear will say we have a veto. There was no veto in the Broughton Archipelago. It was shared decision-making. And everyone needs to understand that we as First Nations want employment and economy, just like everybody else does. But we also, I think more as a global community, are now becoming very much awake to the needs of the environment. And virtually every First Nation case that's gone to the courts and protests and activism has been about stronger environmental parameters that make sense for the environment, not industry. And so I see now that the tide has seriously changed. And I know Don will understand this. It's the first of the flood right now. And we're going to be getting a lot of people that are going to be writing letters and paying attention more so than ever. And the governments are going to have an inescapable path that they must respond to the crisis that is BC wild salmon. First of the flood for all you fishermen out there.
But for me, it's simply not an option. You know, if, you know, we've got it turned around, and if we start losing ground, we'll have to figure out something else to do. You know, the loss of salmon is not an option.
I agree. It'd be like pulling the power cord out of the side of your house. Just everything's going to go dim. Sorry, go ahead, Ian.
No, that's, excuse me, I was wondering you to respond to that, because it seems then that people seem really keyed towards the potential for activism. And I guess some people are afraid of that because they do think, does that require them to put their actual lives at risk, and I think people are just really keen, they're thirsty for knowledge about how to help. And I think there's really two questions that we can maybe finish on. One of which is, what do the fish need? Like, what do they need? Because we're talking about fish, even though this topic is about much more than fish. What do the fish need? And then what do the First Nations need that's going to actually help them get what they need to do done for the fish and for their communities, and ultimately for their own well-being and all of our well-being?
I would just like to answer the first question. The only thing the fish need is for us to get out of the way. I know a lot of people believe in hatcheries but those cost a lot of money, and really they've got the spawning thing down. They just need us to get out of the way. And if we use this science where we can read their immune systems and they start to talk to us again, like they used to talk to First Nations, we can figure out how to get out of their way. That's all they need from us.
That's what I was going to say.
Well, and then finally, though, what can ordinary normal people? Pardon me?
There were two parts to that question, though.
Yeah, well, the other one was, what can we do to support First Nations? Because it seems kind of almost obscene that yet again, in the colonizing process, we've sort of created this problem. And we're now sort of saying to First Nations, well, sorry about that, but you got to fix it for us. So how can we participate in that without?
I'm going to jump in before Bob, because I know he's got a good one here. Again, real simple answer: support salmon. This is certainly a First Nations problem. It's not just our problem; it's everybody's problem. It's this whole thing even goes beyond salmon. So if everybody supports the survival of salmon, you'll be supporting First Nations. You'll also be supporting yourself. You'll be supporting your grandchildren. You'll be supporting their grandchildren. So that's how we support each other.
I think that society in general is pretty hardwired to identify things we disagree with. It's an easy path. And what I would suggest is for Canadians to take a look at what First Nations are saying about stronger environmental protection, about the critical need of salmon for tonight's topic, and to find an alliance, a way to connect and realize that when you see First Nations either protesting or occupying, or in the courts, you'll find that what we are doing is trying to hold the government of Canada to account to its very own law that it absolutely disregards at every turn. Because every one of us that have fought for salmon, we have taken every possible route that we can to bring this to society to understand. And we've all heard that expression, all the planets just happen to line up. Well, that's what happened, I believe, because we had the Auditor General's report, scathing report on DFO on fish farms in spring of 2018. We had the emergence of genome science papers from Dr. Christy Miller-Saunders. We had the Washington State collapse. We had a government that wants to implement the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People. We had provincial tenures that were up for renewal. And we had a wonderful group of incredibly brave people that said enough is enough, and they went to the farms and made that very clear. And so when all of this lined up, it set a table, I believe, that provided the place for the government to implement the UN Declaration on the Broughton Archipelago. And it's because people stood up, and it's because they took a place within their territory, drawing a line saying, that's enough now. This is too important to our people. And I'm really proud that our Giakame, such as Homiskini, Stans Vonvik, and others that have recognized the people that took to the farms and within our cultural ceremonies of a pasa, or what many people know as a potlatch. And it was a way to recognize the strength and tenacity of what these people, my family and my friends, did while we were being the politicians fighting and arguing with government on points of law. And the thing is, I don't think very many Canadians live in a reality where they consider the Constitution and Supreme Court of Law rulings. It's just not something that comes across their screens. But every First Nation leader in Canada lives that reality every day that they do their work. And so we are well versed on the failings of government. And in this regard, we're talking about the complete and utter failure in protecting the environment and the wild salmon. And I think we are honestly think we're at a turning point now where we've got federal, provincial governments that are paying attention and willing to make the proper choices to benefit the environment, First Nations, and everyone that enjoys salmon, including the bears, the whales, the eagles, the wolves, and Don. He really likes
I
salmon.
really like salmon.
Yeah, I know.
Well, that sounds like a remarkably happy note to end on. Alex, one final word from you, perhaps?
I just love these guys so much. It's yeah, it is. It's been, I forget, I've had so many interviews recently. I forget if I've already said this, but my big failing was that I thought I could do this myself. And that was so wrong. And so for everyone who's trying to change something, if you can work with people half as amazing as these two guys, you have a good chance for success. I remember all through the occupation, there was a hereditary leader who is struggling right now. He's had a stroke, but hereditary leader, Chief Arthur Dick, and I would call him from now and then because it was just chaos. Like, okay, what do we do next? And he kept saying, "Don't bring shame to the nation." And to have that kind of guidance in the midst of everything, it kept me aligned and others. And so it's all about your allies. And if they run you over, just get up, just keep going. That's all you can do. We're not here to, train anybody to be a good person or better. It's tough. And so a lot of understanding and forgiveness and toughness just has to come from it. But this was a real pleasure. Thank you so much, everybody, for showing up for this. And yeah, what an honor to be part of this group. Thank you.
Well, that sounds like an amazing idea, a pretty fundamental idea that maybe Canada could listen to, which is don't bring shame to the nation. That's not just a First Nations thing, it seems to me. We've come to the end of our allotted time tonight. Bob Chamberlain, Don Svanvik, thank you so much for joining us and for your wisdom and insights and the willingness to do the work that you do. I think we owe you a great debt of service. Alexandra Morton, on behalf of people around the globe who understand how tenacious and resilient and how determined you've been to do what's right for all life on this planet, to put your own life on the line for what you love, thank you. I have this idea of this book of yours. We never talked about the subtitle, which was How a Renegade Whale Biologist Took on Governments and Industry to Save Wild Salmon. There are going to be many more printings of this book, but I'm looking forward to another edition of this book where it says, didn't happen on my watch, how a renegade whale biologist took on governments and industry to save wild salmon and won. So that's the next edition of the book that we need to see and look forward to. For those of you who joined us tonight, thank you for your time. And let's just end on what Alex Morton says in her book, that this is not the time to give up. Good evening. Thank you.
Ilakasa.
Good night.
Thank you, everybody. Remember, stand up and be counted.
Yes. Thanks, Alexandra.